Hey there, and happy Monday. Hope you're enjoying this beautiful day today. Um, we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday in our story. And when we left off, Mr. Popper had all his penguins at the big theater, and they were a huge hit. And they were just getting ready to get on the train to head back home after the day they had had. So here we are, going to pick up our story. Poor Mr. Popper. One old lady screamed that she was going to get off the train, whether it was going 90 miles an hour or not. A gentleman wearing a clergyman's collar suggested open a window so that the penguins could jump out. Two porters tried to shoo the dogs out of the berth. Finally, the conductor and the brakeman with a lantern came to the rescue. It was quite a while before Mr. Popper got his pets safely into the baggage car. Mrs. Popper worried a little at the start over the idea of having Janie and Bill miss 10 weeks of school while they were traveling on the road, though the children did not seem to mind at all. "And you must remember, my love," said Mr. Popper, who had never before been out of the town of Stillwater, in spite of his dreams of distant countries, "that travel is very broadening." From the start, the Penguins were a big success. Even their opening performance in Seattle went off without a hitch, probably because they had already rehearsed on real stage. It was here that the Penguins added a little novelty number of their own to the program. They were the first thing on the bill. When they finished their regular act, the audience went wild. They clapped and stamped and roared for more of Popper's performing penguins. Janie and Bill helped their father herd the penguins off the stage so that the next act could go on. This next act was a tightrope walker named Mazur Daval. The trouble was that instead of watching him from the wings, as they should have done, the penguins got interested and walked out on stage again to watch him more closely. Unfortunately, at this very moment, I hope you can see it there. See the penguins and the man on the tight walk. Unfortunately, at this moment, Mazur Deval was doing a very difficult dance on the wire overhead. The audience, of course, had thought that the penguins were all through, and they were very much pleased to see them back on the stage. This made everyone laugh so hard that Mazur Daval lost his balance. "Ork," said the penguins, waddling away hurriedly in order not to be under him when he fell. Cleverly recovering his balance, Mazur Daval caught the wire by the inside of his elbow and saved himself. He was very angry when he saw the Poppers performing penguins opening wide their 12 red beaks as if they were laughing at him. "Go away, you dumb things," he said to them in French. "Ork, ork," said the penguins, pretending not to understand and making remarks to each other in penguin language about him. And whenever they appeared, the more they interfered with the other acts on the program, the better the audience liked them. The birds soon became so famous that whenever it was known that the Popper performing penguins were to appear at any theater, the crowds would stand in line for half a mile down the street, waiting for their turns to buy tickets. The other actors on the program were not always so pleased, however. Once in Minneapolis, a celebrated lady opera singer got very much annoyed when she heard that the Popper penguins were to appear on the same program. In fact, she refused to go on stage unless the penguins were put away. So the stagehands helped Mr. and Mrs. Popper and the children get the birds off stage and downstairs to a basement under the stage, while the manager guarded the stage entrance to make sure that the penguins did not get past. Down in the basement, the birds soon discovered another little flight of steps going up, and in another minute the audience was shrieking with laughter as the penguins' heads suddenly appeared one by one in the orchestra pit where the musicians were playing. The magicians kept on playing, and the lady on the stage, when she saw the penguins, sang all the louder to show how angry she was. The audience was laughing so hard that no one could hear the words of her song. Mr. Popper, who had followed the penguin up the stairs, stopped when he saw that it led to the orchestra pit. I don't think I'm supposed to go up there with the musicians, said he told Mrs. Popper. Well, the penguins did, said Mrs. Popper. Papa, you better get them off before they start biting the pegs and the strings fall off their fiddles, said Bill. Oh dear, I just don't know what to do, said Mr. Popper, sitting down helplessly on the top step. Then I will catch the penguin, said Mrs. Popper, climbing up past him with Janey and Bill following. When they saw Mrs. Popper coming after them, the penguins felt very guilty because they knew they did not belong there. So they jumped up on stage, ran over to the footlights, and hid under the singing ladies' blue skirts. That stopped the singing entirely except for one high, shrill note that was not written in the music. The birds loved the bright lights of the theater and the great laughing audiences and all the traveling. There was always something new for them to see. From Stillwater out to the Pacific coast they traveled. It was a long way now to the little house at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, where the Poppers had to worry about whether their money would hold out till spring. And every week, every single week, they got a check for $5,000. When they were not actually playing in some theater or traveling on trains between cities, their lives were spent in larger hotels. Now and then, a startled hotel keeper would object to having birds sign in there. Why, we don't even allow little dogs in this hotel, he would say. Yes, but do you have a rule against penguins? Mr. Popper would ask. Then the hotel keeper would have to admit that there was no rule for penguins at all. And of course, when he saw how neat the penguins were and how other guests came to his hotel in hope of seeing them, he was very, very glad to have them. You might think that a large hotel would offer a great many opportunities for mischief to a lot of penguins, but they behaved very well and, on the whole, never doing anything worse than riding up and down too much in the elevators and occasionally biting the brass buttons off some bellboy's uniform. $5,000 a week may sound like a great deal of money, and yet the Poppers were still very far from rich. It was quite expensive to live in grand hotels and travel about town in taxicabs. Mr. Popper often thought that the penguins could do just as well have walked back and forth between the hotels and theaters, but every one of their walks looked so much like a parade that it always tied up traffic. So Mr. Popper, who never liked to be a nuisance to anyone, always took taxis instead. It was expensive to have huge cakes of ice brought up to their hotel rooms to cool the penguins. The bills in their fine restaurants where the Poppers often took their meals were often dreadfully high. Fortunately, however, the penguins' food had stopped being an expense to them. On the road, they had to give up having tank cars of live fish shipped to them because it was so hard to get the deliveries on time. So they went back to feeding the penguins canned shrimp. This cost them absolutely nothing, for Mr. Popper had written a testimonial saying, Popper's Performing Penguins love Owen's Oceanic Shrimp. This statement, with a picture of the 12 penguins, was printed in all the leading magazines, and the Owens Oceanic Shrimp Company gave Mr. Popper an order that was good for free cans of shrimp at any grocery store anywhere in the country. Several other companies, just such as the Great Western Spinach Growers Association and the energetic Breakfast Oats Company, wanted him to recommend their product too, and they offered him large sums of cash. But the penguins simply refused to eat spinach or oats, and Mr. Popper was much too honest to say they would, even though he knew the money would come in handy. From the Pacific coast, they turned east again to cross the continent. They had time enough on this brief tour to touch only the larger cities. After Minneapolis, they played Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. Wherever they went, their reputation traveled ahead of them. When early in April they reached Boston, huge crowds awaited them at the railway station. Up until now, it had not been too difficult to keep the penguins comfortable, but a warm spring wind was blowing across Boston Common, and at the hotel, Mr. Popper had to have ice brought up to his rooms in 1,000-pound cakes. He was glad that the 10-week contract was almost up, and that the next week, when the birds were to appear in New York, was the last. Already, Mr. Greenbaum was writing about a new contract. Mr. Piper was beginning to think, however, that he had better be getting back to Stillwater, for the penguins were growing irritable. And the next chapter, which is chapter 18, is called April Winds. It was unseasonably warm in Boston. It was actually hot in New York. In their rooms at the Great Tower Hotel overlooking Central Park, the penguins were feeling the heat very badly. Mr. Popper took them up to the garden roof to catch whatever cool breeze might be blowing. The penguins were all charmed by the sparkling lights and the confusion of the city below. The younger birds began crowding over to the edge of the roof and looking down at the great canyons beneath them. It made Mr. Popper very nervous to see them shoving each other as if any moment they might succeed in pushing one over. He remembered how the South Pole penguins always did this to find out what danger lay below. The roof was not a safe place for them. Mr. Popper had never forgotten how badly frightened he had been when Captain Cook had been so ill before Greta came. He could not risk the chance of losing one of his penguins now. Where the penguins were concerned, nothing was ever too much trouble for him. He took them downstairs again, and he bathed them under the cold showers in the bathroom. This kept him busy for a large part of the night. With all this lack of sleep, he was quite drowsy the next morning when he had to call the taxis to get to the theater. Besides, Mr. Popper had always been a little bit absent-minded. That is how he made his great mistake when he said to the first taxi driver, "Regal Theater." "Yes, sir," said the driver, threading his way in and out of traffic on Broadway, which greatly interested both the children and the penguins. They had almost reached the theater when the driver suddenly turned. "Say," he said, you don't mean to say those penguins are going to be on the same bill with the Swenson seals, do you?" "Well, I don't know what else is on the bill," said Mr. Popper, paying him. "Anyway, here's Regal." And they piled out, and filed into the stage entrance. In the wings stood a large, burly, red-faced man. "So these are the Popper performing penguins, huh?" he said. "Well, I want to tell you, Mr. Popper, that I'm Swen Swenson, and those are my seals in there on stage now. And if your birds try any funny business, it'll be too bad for them, because my seals are tough, see? I don't think they would think nothing of eating 2 or 3 penguins each." From the stage could be heard the hoarse barks of the seals, who were going through their act. "Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "the penguins are the last act on the bill. You go back quick. You go run back quick and get those taxis, and we'll let the penguins ride around while there's still time for their number, until it's time for their number." Mr. Popper hurried out to catch the drivers. When he returned, it was too late. The Popper performing penguins had already discovered the Swenson seals. "Papa, I can't look!" cried the children. There was a sound of dreadful confusion on the stage. The audience was in an uproar, and the curtain came down quickly. When the Poppers rushed onto the stage, both the penguins and the seals had found the stairway leading to the Swenson dressing room, and they were on their way upstairs. "I can't bear to think what's happening up there," said Mr. Popper with a shudder. Mr. Swenson only laughed. "I hope your birds were insured, Popper," he said. "How much are they worth?" "Well, let's go up and look." "You go up, Papa," said Mrs. Popper. "Bill, you run out to the theater and call the police to come and try to save some of our penguins." "I'll get the fire department," yelled Jamie. When the firemen, with great clanking, came and set up their ladders so that they could get in through the window of Mr. Swenson's dressing room, they were a little vexed to find there was no fire at all. However, When they when they found 6 black-mustached seals sitting barking in the middle of the room, with 12 penguins parading gladly around them in a square, they felt better. Then the policemen came in their patrol and climbed up the ladder which the firemen had left against the building. By the time they too came through the window, they could scarcely believe their eyes, for the firemen had put firemen helmets on the penguins, which made the delighted birds look very silly and girlish. Seeing the firemen so friendly with the penguins, the policemen naturally took sides with the seal and put policeman caps on them. The seals looked very fierce with their long black mustaches and black faces underneath. The penguins, under the fireman's helmet, were parading in front of the policeman, while the seals, in their policeman caps, were barking at the firemen. When Mr. Popper and Mr. Swenson finally opened the door. And there you see them. One's got the fireman's hat on, and one has the police hat on. Mr. Popper sat down. His relief was so great that for a moment he could not speak. "You policemen better get your hats off my seals now," said Mr. Swenson. "I got to go down on stage and finish the act." Then he and his 6 seals slipped out of the room with a few parting barks. "Well, goodbye, Doc," said the fireman, regretfully removing their helmets from the penguins and putting them on their own heads. Then they disappeared down the ladder. The penguins, of course, wanted to follow, but Mr. Popper held them back. Just then, the door flew open, and the theater manager burst into the room. "Hold that man!" he shouted to the policeman, pointing to Mr. Popper. "I have a warrant for his arrest." "Who, me?" said Mr. Popper in a daze. What have I done?" "You've broken into my theater and thrown the place into a panic. That's what you've done. You are a disturber of the peace, Mr. Popper." But I'm Mr. Popper, and these are my performing penguins. They're famous from coast to coast." "I don't care who you are. You haven't any business in my theater." But Mr. Greenbaum is going to pay us $5,000 a week at the Regal." "Mr. Greenbaum's theater is the Royal, not the Regal. You've come to the wrong theater. Anyway, out you go, you and your performing penguins. The patrolman is waiting outside." So Mr. Popper, with Captain Cook, Greta, Columbus, Louisa, Nelson, Jenny, Magellan, Adelina, Scott, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria, were bundled up into the patrolman's wagon and taken to the police station. None of his pleas could move the desk sergeant. That theater manager is pretty mad at the way you bursted into his theater, so I'm holding you. I'm going to give you all a nice quiet cell until you furnish your bail. I'm putting the bail at $500 for you and $100 for each of the birds." Yikesy pikesy, that's a lot of money. Of course, Mr. Popper did not have that much money about him. Neither did Mrs. Popper when they telephoned her at the hotel. The hotel bill was paid for several days ahead, but she had no cash. The check for the final week's salary was not due until the end of the week. Indeed, it now looked as if the Poppers would never see that check, since they could not get the penguins out of jail long enough to put on their act at the Royal Theater. If only they could have gotten in touch with Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Popper knew that kind man would have gotten them out. But Mr. Greenbaum was somewhere in Hollywood, out on the Pacific coast, and the Poppers had no idea at all how to reach him. It was very, very dull for the birds in jail. Wednesday came, and there was still no word from Mr. Greenbaum. Thursday, the birds began to droop. It was soon apparent that the lack of exercise, combined with the heat, might prove way too much for them. There were no more tricks or merry games. Even the younger birds sat all day in dismal silence, and even Mr. Popper could not cheer them up. And you see them sitting all in the jail right there. I'm sure it's quite warm in that jail. That's why they don't like to be in there. Mr. Popper had a feeling that Mr. Greenbaum would probably turn up by the end of the week to see about renewing the contract, but Friday passed with no news from him. Saturday morning, Mr. Popper got up very early and smoothed his hair. Then he dusted off the penguins as well as he could, for he wanted everything to look as presentable as possible, just in case Mr. Greenbaum should appear. About 10 o'clock, there was a sound of footsteps in the hall and a jingling of keys, and the door of the cell was open. "You're free, Mr. Popper. There's a friend of yours here." Mr. Popper stepped out into the light with the penguins. "You're barely in time, Mr. Greenbaum," he was about to say. But then, as his eyes became accustomed to the light, he looked again. It was not Mr. Greenbaum who stood there. It was a great bearded man in a splendid uniform. Smiling, he held out his hand to Mr. Popper. "Mr. Popper," he said, "I am Admiral Drake." "Admiral Drake," gasped Mr. Popper. "You mean from the South Pole?" "Yes," said the Admiral. "The Drake Antarctica expedition ship returned yesterday. You should have seen the reception New York gave us. You can read about it in today's paper. But I read about the trouble you were having over the penguins, and so here I am. I have a long, long story to tell you." "Well, could we go to the hotel and talk about it?" asked Mr. Popper. "My wife will be anxious to see us get back." "Certainly," said the Admiral. And when they were all settled in the Popper rooms at the hotel, with the penguins clustering around to listen, Admiral Drake began. "Naturally, when I knew that I was coming back to America, I often thought about the man whom I had sent the penguin. It takes a long time to hear things down there, and I often wondered how you and your bird were getting along. Last night at the mayor's dinner fuss, I heard about the wonderful trained penguin act you had been putting on all over the country. This morning I picked up the paper, and the first thing I read was that Mr. Popper and his 12 penguins were still being held in jail." "But 12 penguins, Mr. Popper! How on earth?" Then Mr. Popper told how Greta had arrived to keep Captain Cook from being lonely, and how the little penguins had grown, and how the clever little band had saved the day for the Poppers when things had looked so bad. "It is an amazing story," said Admiral Drake. "I've seen a lot of penguins in my time, but never such educated ones as these. It just shows what patience and training can do. But now to get to my real point, Mr. Popper. You probably know that I've explored the North Pole as well as the South Pole." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Popper respectfully. "I have read books about both your Arctic and your Antarctic expeditions." "Well, then," said the Admiral, "maybe you know why we explorers prefer the South Pole." "Could it be because of the penguins, sir?" asked Janie, who had been listening very hard. Admiral Drake patted her head. "Yes, my dear. Those long polar nights get pretty dull when you have no pets to play with. Of course, there are polar bears up there, but you can't play with them. Nobody knows why there are no penguins at the North Pole. For a long time, the United States government had been wanting me to lead an expedition up there for the purpose of establishing a family of penguins. I must come to the point, Mr. Popper. You've had such remarkable success with the birds of yours. Why not let me take them to the North Pole and start a race of penguins there?" Just then, Mr. Greenbaum and another gentleman were announced. They shook hands all around and were introduced to the Admiral. "Well, Popper," said Mr. Greenbaum, "too bad about that mix-up over at the theaters. But never mind. Here's Mr. Klein, who owns the Colossal Film Company. He's going to make you a fortune. You'll be a poor man no longer, Mr. Popper." "Poor," said Mr. Popper. "I'm not poor. These birds have been earning us $5,000 a week." "Oh, $5,000, said Mr. King. "What's that? That's hardly any money. I want to put these birds in the movies, Mr. Popper. We've got a story department working on stories for them already. Why, I'll put each of your birds under a contract that will keep you and your wife on Easy Street for the rest of your lives." "Papa," whispered Mrs. Popper, I don't want to live on Easy Street. I want to go back to Proudfoot Avenue." "Better consider," Mr. Popper said, the Admiral. I can't offer you anything like that. You say those men at the North Pole get lonely because there are no penguins? Asked Mr. Popper. Yep, they get very lonely. But if there were penguins up there, mightn't the polar bears eat them? Oh, ordinary penguins, yes, said the Admiral, but not such highly trained birds as yours. It was now Mr. Klein's turn to speak. In every moving picture house in America, little children would have the pleasure of seeing these stories acted out by Popper's performing penguins, he said. Of course, if we succeeded in establishing the breed at North Pole, said the Admiral, the name might have to be changed a little. I imagine that hundreds of years from now, scientists would be calling them Popper Arctic penguins. Mr. Popper was silent for a while. Gentlemen, he said, I want to thank you both, but I will give you your decision tomorrow. And this last chapter is called Farewell, Mr. Popper. It was a hard decision to make. Long after the visitors had gone, Mr. Popper and Mrs. Popper sat and discussed what was best for everybody. Mrs. Popper could see the advantages of both offers, and she pointed these out without trying to influence them. I see that the penguins are really your responsibility, she said, so you must make up your mind. It was a pale and haggard Mr. Popper who was ready to announce his decision next day. Mr. Klein, he said, I want you to know how much I appreciate your offer of putting my birds into the movies, but I'm afraid I have to refuse. I do not believe the life in Hollywood would be very good for my penguins. And then he turned to Admiral Drake. Admiral Drake, after a lot of careful thinking, I'm going to give the birds to you. In doing this, I am considering the birds first of all. I know that they've been comfortable and happy with me. Lately, though, with the excitement and the warm weather, I've been worried about them. The birds have done so much for me that I have to do what is best for them. After all, they do belong in a cold climate. And then I can't help being sorry for those men up at the North Pole without any penguins to help them pass time. Your government will thank you, Mr. Popper, answered the Admiral. Congratulations, Admiral, said Mr. Klein. Maybe you're right at that, Popper. Hollywood might have been too much for those birds. I wish you'd let me make one short movie of them here in New York, though, before they go. Just some pictures of the sort of thing they do on stage, you know. We'll show the film everywhere with an announcement that these are the famous Popper penguins that are being taken to the North Pole by the Admiral Drake of the United States Arctic Penguin Foundation Expedition, or something like that. Why, I would like that very much. Let's see if you can see a picture. I would like that very much, said Mr. Popper. We'll pay you, of course, said Mr. Klein. Not a fortune as you could have if you would let us give them a contract, but say, how about $25,000? We could use it, said Mrs. Popper. It will be very quiet at 432 Proudfoot Avenue, said Mr. Popper when everyone had left. Mrs. Popper didn't answer. She knew that nothing she could say would really comfort him. However, said Mr. Popper, now that spring is here, a lot of people will be wanting their houses painted, so we better be getting back. Anyway, said Bill, we've had a whole 10 weeks of vacation right in the middle of the year, and not many children in Stillwater can say that. The next day, the cameramen arrived to make pictures of the penguins doing their tricks. It was arranged that the penguins should stay in New York just long enough to see the expedition off. Meanwhile, in the harbor, the great sailing ship of Admiral Drake was being made ready for its long trip north. Every day, huge boxes of supplies of all sorts were hustled on board. The most comfortable quarters on the ship were turned over to the penguins, who were the cause of the whole voyage. Captain Cook was already quite familiar with the ship, since it was the same one the Admiral had sailed to the South Pole, where Captain Cook had often seen it. Greta, too, had seen vessels of its kind. The two of them were kept very busy showing and explaining everything to Nelson, Columbus, Louisa, Jenny, Scott, Magellan, Adelina, Isabel, Ferdinand, and Victoria. The sailors all took the greatest delight in watching the curious little birds at their explorations. It looks like this is going to be a pretty lively trip, they would say. These popper penguins certainly live up to their expectations and their reputation. But at last everything was ready, and the day came when the poppers were to go down and say goodbye. Bill and Janie ran all over the ship and did not want to leave when it was time to draw up the gangplank. The admiral shook hands with them and Mrs. Popper and thanked them for for having helped to train the extraordinary penguins that were a real contribution to science. Mr. Popper had gone down below to say a private farewell to the birds. All that kept him from breaking down completely was the knowledge that what he was doing was best for them too. First, he said goodbye to all the young penguins, then to Greta, who had saved Captain Hook. Then, last of all, he leaned over and he said a special goodbye to Captain Cook, who had come and made life so different for Mr. Popper and his family. And then he wiped his eyes, he straightened his back, and he went off on deck to say goodbye to Admiral Drake. So Mr. Popper's feeling really, really sad there. Goodbye, Admiral Drake, he said. Goodbye, repeated the Admiral. Why, what do you mean? Aren't you coming with us? Me? Me go with you to the North Pole? Why, of course, Mr. Popper. But how can I go with you? I'm not an explorer or a scientist. I'm only a house painter. You're the keeper of the penguins, aren't you? Roared the Admiral. Man alive! Aren't those penguins the reason for this whole expedition? And who's going to see that they're well and happy if you're not along? Go put on one of those fur suits like the rest of us. We're pulling anchor in just a minute. Mama! Shouted Mr. Popper to Mrs. Popper, who had already gone down the gangplank. I'm going too! I'm going too! Admiral Drake says he needs me. Mama, do you mind if I don't come home for a year or two? Oh, as to that, said Mrs. Popper, I'll miss you very much, my dear, but we have money to live on for a few years. And in winter, it'll be much easier to keep the house tidy without a man sitting around all day. I'll be getting back to Stillwater. Tomorrow's the day for the meeting of the Ladies' Aid and Missionary Society, and I'll be just fine. So goodbye. Goodbye, my love, and good luck. Goodbye and good luck, echoed the children, and the penguins, hearing their voices, scuttled up on deck and stood there beside the Admiral and Mr. Popper. Then they solemnly lifted their flippers and waved as the great ship moved slowly down the river and out into the sea. The end. I would have never thought Mr. Popper would be joining them. And that's the end of our book. And I have another great book that I'll be starting. I just wanted to make sure that we finished off that one. I hope you're enjoying your spring break, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.